back, diligent students, to eCoreAcademy. My name is Anita and today I will be bringing you a new anatomy and physiology video. I know many of you have been waiting for this playlist to be updated, so I wanted to do a new video on the cardiovascular unit I promised all of you. If you haven't watched my cardiovascular system overview and diagram, please go watch that before watching this video. If not, get your notes out and get ready to take some great notes on this system. So my last video was Heart Anatomy Part 1, where we talked about the location and situation of the heart relative to other organs and structures in the body, such as bones, veins, arteries, etc. Today, we're going to be focusing on the heart itself. So we're going to be looking at a cross-section of the heart. We're going to be looking at the functions of the heart, its responsibilities, what actually is inside of the heart, what is part of this cardiovascular system, and so forth. That's going to be our focus for today. Before I even get into the content planned, please pause this video, like the video if you like our anatomy and physiology videos so far, subscribe to our channel to join our great and growing student community, and lastly, hit the post notification bell. Also, if you really can, please share these videos using our social media accounts in the description box below. All right, let's get right into the content I have planned for today. Again, this is Heart Anatomy Part 2. We're going to be looking at different parts of the heart and the purposes that each of these parts serve, how they work together to create this amazing system, and how they work together to form an organ that is so essential to our systems, other systems, and the way we live. Okay, so let's look at the first part of the heart that I want to bring your attention to. These are the atria. Atria is plural for atrium. Atrium is the singular form. So when you're referring to both of them, we're going to be calling them atria. And when I say both of them, there are two. So this right here, I've actually circled them on this diagram. If you come over here, this is your right atrium, this structure right over here. I know if you're looking at the diagram right now on the screen, it looks like it's on the left side. However, the heart, remember, is positioned in your chest. So when you're looking forward, your heart is facing the same direction as you. So if you flip this the other way, this is actually your right atrium, and then this over here is your left atrium. These are two of the four chambers, as in cavities of the heart. They are two of the main four parts of your heart. So let's go over what these atria actually do. So the right atrium, which is right over here, whenever I refer to right atrium, I'm referring to this structure, this chamber of the heart. The right atrium collects deoxygenated blood returning from the body. So remember, deoxygenated blood is your blue blood or your black blood. It's your waste-filled, carbon dioxide-filled blood. It's the blood that's returning from your body after dropping off the oxygen and nutrients in your cells. It collects the waste from your cells and brings that blood and waste back to the heart so that the lungs can get rid of the waste in your blood. So in order to get to the lungs, that deoxygenated blood needs to first enter the heart. This blood enters through the superior vena cava, which is up here, and the inferior vena cava, which is down here where my cursor is. And if you see, both of these vena cavae, they empty into your right atrium. So your right atrium is the first chamber of the heart that blood comes into contact with. It enters, like I said, through the vena cava, your inferior, which is your bottom one, and your superior, which connect and empty both into your right atrium, empty that deoxygenated blood into your right atrium. And then what the right atrium does is to get that deoxygenated blood to the lungs, it forces the blood into the right ventricle. We're going to be going over the ventricle soon, but this right here, the second chamber of the heart, it is your right ventricle. It's positioned right below your right atrium. So what your right atrium does, like I just said, it forces blood into your right ventricle. The separation between these two chambers of the heart is called the tricuspid valve. It's this white-looking thing right here, and all of these white-looking things, these are valves of the heart. So we're going to be going over what the purpose of these valves are, but just know that the right atrium forces blood into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is called this because if you look at this prefix tri, it has 3 flaps. Usually valves have 2 flaps, but this valve is special because it has 3 flaps. Therefore, we denote it by calling it the tricuspid valve. So remember, the tricuspid valve is the valve that separates the right atrium and the right ventricle. The right atrium will receive the deoxygenated blood returning from the body to the heart through the vena cava, and it'll force that deoxygenated blood into your right ventricle through your tricuspid valve. Now let's look at your left atrium. Your left atrium is on this side of your heart, as I showed you before. It collects oxygenated blood returning from lungs. So we're going to be going over how that whole process works, but just know that your right ventricle, which is right down here, pushes blood up into this purple structure here, and this purple structure takes that deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The lungs will take care of the carbon dioxide you breathe out. The carbon dioxide will be released from your bloodstream, and your lungs supply these blood vessels with oxygen. So your red blood cells collect that oxygen, and that oxygenated blood has to return to your heart. Returns to your heart, and the first chamber it meets is your left atrium. So your left atrium collects oxygenated blood, newly oxygenated blood, returning from your lungs. Then what your left atrium will do is it forces that blood into the left ventricle. Just like your right atrium forced the blood into your right ventricle, so your right ventricle could push that deoxygenated blood into your lungs, your left atrium will push that oxygenated blood into your left ventricle, so your left ventricle can push that oxygenated blood throughout your body. Again, your left ventricle is this red chamber right here. It is the fourth and final chamber of your heart. We're going to be going over it along with the right ventricle later on. So, like I said, the left atrium forces blood into your left ventricle. And this is done through the mitral valve. Just like the tricuspid valve is over here, this partition between the right atrium and the right ventricle, you have the mitral valve as the partition between your left atrium and your left ventricle. You can also call this a bicuspid valve because it only has two flaps as opposed to the tricuspid valve's three flaps. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we're going to be talking about the valves. I know I keep saying valves, but let's clarify what that actually is for all of you. So this is going to be my first slide on valves. This first slide is going to cover the atrioventricular, also known as AV valves. So I know this is a large word, so let's dissect it together. So let's dissect this atrioventricular into two parts, atrio and ventricular. So what does atrio sound like? Atrio sounds like atrium. Ventricular sounds like ventricle. So these valves are the valves that separate your atria from your ventricles. They're the valves located between your atria and your ventricles. So these include the tricuspid valve and the mitral, which is the bicuspid valve, which we were talking about. Again, the tricuspid valve is right over here where my cursor is. It separates your right atrium from your right ventricle, and your mitral, also known as your bicuspid valve because it has only two flaps opposed to the tricuspid's three flaps. It separates your left atrium from your left ventricle. So the purpose of these valves is to prevent flow of blood from the ventricles to atria. So what does this mean? Think of blood flow through the heart based off of what I've just told you. Blood has to flow from the atria to the ventricles. Blood flows from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Blood flows from the left atrium to the left ventricle. The blood is not supposed to flow backward, meaning the blood is not supposed to be flowing from the right ventricle to the right atrium, and on this side of the heart, blood is not supposed to be flowing from the left ventricle to the left atrium. That is called backflow, and that shouldn't be happening when your heart is contracting. It can be detrimental to getting blood throughout your body. It's not good. Let's put it that way. In other words, these valves prevent backflow of blood. But blood needs a forward flow. These valves make sure after your right atrium, let's say for example, pushes blood into your right ventricle, your tricuspid valve will close so that blood does not return to your right atrium. That's the purpose of these valves. It keeps blood flowing in the right direction. Okay, let's look at the ventricles because I've been talking about the atria, but the atria work in tandem with the ventricles. The ventricles, there are two of them in your heart, and they're also two major chambers / cavities of the heart. Let's look at your right ventricle first. Your right ventricle is right down here where my cursor is. It's located right underneath your right atrium. It collects deoxygenated blood from the right atrium, like I told you. Deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium through the Vena Cavae, and then your right atrium forces that deoxygenated blood into your right ventricle. And then what your right ventricle will do with that deoxygenated blood, your right ventricle is trying to get that deoxygenated blood to the lungs so the deoxygenated blood can get rid of the carbon dioxide and waste that is collected, and so that it can gain oxygen and other nutrients for its journey back into the body to deliver those things to cells that need them. So what this ventricle does is it forces blood into this purplish structure that I was talking about where my cursor is, and into these two tubes, and these two tubes take the blood to the lungs. Hence, your right ventricle makes sure that blood gets to your lungs. It forces blood into your lungs, and it uses what's called the pulmonary valve. The pulmonary valve is right here on this purplish structure. And we'll be talking about it later on, but just note that we use the word pulmonary. So what have we been using the word pulmonary to represent? We talked about pulmonary flow, and thus pulmonary really denotes your lungs. This is a valve that connects your right ventricle to your lungs. Therefore, we call it the pulmonary valve because it leads to the lungs. The other ventricle I want to talk about is your left ventricle. Your left ventricle is right here in red, located underneath your left atrium. It is the largest and strongest chamber of the heart, and we'll be talking about why. So, if you think about it this way, your left atrium, which is right up here, is receiving oxygenated blood, newly oxygenated blood, returning from the lungs. Your left atrium will then push that blood into your left ventricle. After the left ventricle, where do you think that blood needs to go? Think about it for a second. Well, that oxygenated blood needs to return through the body. Therefore, it needs to be pushed all throughout your body. That's why your left ventricle is the largest and strongest chamber of the heart. It is the last chamber, meaning it needs to be able to push all of the blood that it just collected, that oxygenated blood, throughout all of the vessels in your body so that oxygenated blood can reach all the cells that need it. That's why it's the largest and strongest chamber of the heart. Hopefully you get that. So how does the left ventricle get that blood throughout your body? Well, it pushes the blood through the aortic valve. The aortic valve is right here to the right of the pulmonary valve. The pulmonary valve is in purple, and your aortic valve is in a light red, right over here where my cursor is. The reason it's called the aortic valve is because if you follow this tube structure, this light reddish tube structure, this curvature, this arch is what we call the aorta. The aorta is one of the great vessels of the heart and of the body. The aorta is just a gigantic artery. Artery means, remember what I was talking about, away. So veins bring blood back to the heart. Arteries take blood away from the heart. You can remember this because artery starts with A and away starts with A. So blood is pushed away from the heart using the aorta. Therefore, your left ventricle is pushing blood through your aortic valve and into your aorta, and then your aorta will thus distribute that blood through the multiple arteries in your body. And the aortic valve just makes sure that blood does not flow backward from your aorta into your left ventricle, as that's the purpose of all valves. So the aortic valve takes blood all throughout the body. So it makes sure that it'll close after the left ventricle is done pushing blood into the aorta, and the aorta will distribute that blood, like I said, throughout your arteries. So those are the ventricles. Let's talk about the second slide I have on valves. So we just talked about two major valves when we're talking about the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The first one that corresponds with the right ventricle is your pulmonary valve. If you just need a reminder, your pulmonary valve is right here where my cursor is. It is the purple valve. It prevents backflow of blood, like I've been talking about how all valves prevent backflow of blood. We need a constant forward flow of blood. We don't want backflow of blood. And these valves will close to make sure that blood doesn't flow in the wrong direction. So it connects the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. This right here is your right ventricle, just a refresher. And this structure right here, this purple structure, is what we call the pulmonary trunk. This trunk eventually branches off into two arteries right here, and those arteries will take the deoxygenated blood to your lungs. So again, your pulmonary valve is located right between your right ventricle and your pulmonary trunk, and then further on your lungs. Let's talk about your aortic valve now. So your aortic valve is located to the right of your pulmonary valve on this diagram. It is in light red. So it also prevents backflow of blood. It closes after the left ventricle pushes blood into the aorta to make sure that blood doesn't go back into the left ventricle after it's left. So it connects, like I just said, the left ventricle to the aorta. The left ventricle is the largest and strongest chamber of your heart. It receives that oxygenated blood from your left atrium, and then it'll push that blood throughout the body, but that blood isn't supposed to come back to the left ventricle. So your aortic valve will make sure that it closes, and then the aorta will thus distribute all that oxygenated blood throughout all the arteries that are connected to it because it is a great vessel. Okay, so now that we're done with the valves and the atria and the ventricles, let's talk about some types of heart cells. So heart cells are important because they're part of what's called the conducting system of the heart. The heart is an involuntary muscle. What does this mean? So if I move my hand like this, I'm voluntarily moving it. I'm controlling my hand. It is a voluntary movement. Therefore, the muscles that are part of that are voluntary muscles. However, I don't consciously make sure that my heart beats. My heart beats on its own. It's an involuntary muscle. And therefore, because it is constantly beating, it's a very active organ in your body and a very important organ in your body. It has specialized heart cells. And there are two main types. So first, let's look at what heart cells are. We call them cardiac muscle cells because your heart is really just a muscular organ, and cardiac refers to your heart. So cardiac muscle cells. So before I even get into anything I've written on the slide, let me just briefly go over what cardiac muscle cells are. So if you look at a cardiac muscle cell, I don't have a diagram up here because we're going to be talking about them later on, but let me just give you a preview of what we have prepared. So a cardiac muscle cell, these muscle cells are branching in that they're just all connected to each other like branches. Also, these cardiac muscle cells have 1 to 2 nuclei. They might not just have a single one, they might have multiple, just as they have a large concentration of mitochondria. The mitochondrium are the powerhouse of the cell. They help produce ATP, which just fuels energy and gives those cells the ability to squeeze and contract and be muscular cell and be muscle cells. Also, if you look at the actual surface of a cardiac muscle cell, they're a little bit rougher than your smooth skeletal muscle cells. They have a lot of differences when it comes to that. If you look at the internals of a cardiac muscle cell, you will see intercalated discs. Intercalated discs pretty much just connect these cardiac muscle cells. These cardiac muscle cells are not acting individually. They're all connected like a cell community, for lack of a better word. And these intercalated discs make sure that they stay connected, especially because the heart is just constantly squeezing and pumping. These cells don't want to come loose. They need to stay together so that your heart muscle actually stays together. So your intercalated discs have structures in them that make sure that this happens. First of all, they have desmosomes. Desmosomes make sure that there's adhesion between the cells. This means that the cells stay together, that they don't split apart and just spread throughout your chest cavity and your heart just falls apart. Because your heart is constantly contracting, stretching, squeezing. These cells need to be very rigorously held together. In addition, there are these structures called gap junctions in the intercalated discs. I wrote it right here. The cardiac muscle cells are mainly joined by these gap junctions. So these gap junctions, through them, you have chemical messages. These are how the cells communicate with one another. These gap junctions have calcium and sodium ions flowing between them, and that's how these cells communicate with one another to know when to act in tandem, to know when to squeeze, to when these nodes that we'll be talking about, when your heart sends an electrical shock through it so that it squeezes and contracts and relaxes accordingly. These gap junctions make sure all the cells know what's happening in what the heart is going to do. If your heart wants to squeeze, then these gap junctions convey the message to all your cells so that they act in tandem and your heart muscle can actually squeeze. So those are some of the basic parts of the cell. If you look down here, your cardiac muscle cells are very special because they permit action potentials to be conducted between cells. Remember, this can only be conducted between cells because of these gap junctions, as in these communication pathways. So action potentials are a part of the conducting system of the heart. We'll be talking about this later on. I'll have like a whole video dedicated to this. But if you think about it, how does your heart actually fire? How does it squeeze and contract? Well, your heart has its own electrical system. Think about something that runs on electricity. It needs to be charged. It needs to be told how does it actually work? It needs power. It needs to be charged. Similarly, your heart sends an electrical pulse through itself so that your cells know when to contract and squeeze and when to relax and smoothen. So action potentials happen when you just have this electrical pulse that goes throughout your cells. It's just like this electrical explosion, and it results in this depolarization current, which makes all the cells contract and squeeze or relax and do those things accordingly. So those are what cardiac muscle cells mainly do. Let's look at the two main types. You have pacemaker cells and then contractile cells. So look at the pacemaker cells. You've probably heard of what a pacemaker is. So these cells are like the leaders. They start the electrical pulse. We'll be looking at the conducting system like I told you before, but pacemaker cells are extremely specialized cells. They're mainly only located in your sinoatrial node. That's where the highest concentration of them are. And the SA node is located at the beginning of the conducting system, which means these pacemaker cells begin the electrical current that goes through your heart to make it squeeze and relax and do all those functions. So these are specialized cells that cause involuntary muscles to contract and move as per their function. So they help our involuntary heart muscles, which function on our own without us consciously making our hearts beat, to contract and move as they need to keep our systems and our bodies going. If you look at contractile cells, they're the ones that follow. They're like your muscle cells. They're the ones that actually have your heart squeezing, and they're the ones that receive these communications through gap junctions from your pacemaker cells that, yes, the heart needs to squeeze now, the heart needs to contract now, that the heart needs to relax now. So they're also known as cardiomyocytes and myocardiocytes. Those are just the more scientific names. So if you think about it, these are like if you want to think about a factory, these are like your CEOs. They tell their workers when something needs to happen, how it needs to be done, and things like that. The contractile cells are the ones who actually execute those things. They are your workers. So your pacemaker cells initiate the command to squeeze or to contract or relax. Your contractile cells will actually do the contraction, and they will also do the relaxation. So these are types of heart cells. Again, we'll be going over these more in depth, but I just want to give you a heads up of what we'll be doing later on. Now let's look at the myocardium. So the myocardium is a thick middle layer that contains specialized muscle cells. So there are four main layers, outer layers of heart muscle. We're going to be going over them specifically going over them in future videos, but I'll just tell you the outermost is the pericardium, that sac enclosing the heart that I talked about in the last video. Then you have the epicardium, then you have the myocardium, and then you have the endocardium. So those are the four main the outer parts of your heart muscle. So the main thing about the myocardium, the reason why it's so special is because it actually regulates the contraction and relaxation of your heart muscle. Your heart is actually able to beat because of what the myocardium has in itself. So again, the myocardium is a thick middle layer because it and the epicardium are the two middle layers, the second and the third layer, and it contains specialized muscle cells. It contains these cells that I was talking about right here, these pacemaker cells that begin the electrical impulse so that the heart knows when to contract and relax, and then the contractile cells, the ones that actually do the contraction and relaxation. And these cells, again, use gap junctions to communicate, and they use action potentials, and a depolarization current flows through them, and this is how they communicate chemically to get these functions done. And these cells are all located in the myocardium. The myocardium is mainly important for three main reasons. It provides structure and support for your cardiac muscles, which is the first one. It regulates when your heart contracts and relaxes. And third, it makes up the conducting system of your heart. Like I said, the electrical pulse that goes through your heart, so your heart knows when to squeeze and when to relax. So it initiates cardiac action potentials through intercalated means between, because remember, the intercalated discs are located between the cardiac muscle cells of calcium. So the action potentials are those electrical explosions when your cells are communicating to each other, saying, hey, we need to contract. Hey, we need to relax. So it occurs through a huge depolarization wave, which means that calcium ions and sodium ions are just flowing in these gap junctions, and they bring chemical messages with them between these muscle cells. These cells also speed communication between muscle cells of the heart. Like we said, the intercalated discs have gap junctions that are located in the myocardium, and the chemical messages get through these gap junctions very quickly so that these cells can contract, and just an impulse is spread very quickly, second by second, and your heart is constantly sending these electrical impulses electrical pulses. So your muscle cells need to be in tune with each other. Okay, so now that that's all out of the way, let's get back to some major parts of the heart. We're back to this diagram that I was using before. So now let's talk about the aorta. The aorta is located up here. Like I said, it's this branching structure right here. And it has its own valve, the aortic valve. It is connected to the left ventricle. So right down here, I have what the aorta is. The aorta is the largest artery, and it carries oxygenated blood from the heart to the body. So again, let's do a review of some of the great vessels. So the great vessels are the main veins and arteries in your body. These are the vessels that blood uses to travel. These are the two major veins right here. We'll be talking about them on next slide or the one after that, and this is your great artery, and it's called the aorta. It has its own special name. So remember, veins bring deoxygenated blue blood back to your heart so that it can get oxygenated, whereas arteries take blood away from your heart, oxygen-rich and nutrient-rich blood that cells need that are dispersed throughout your body. So your aorta is your largest artery. It's right here. So your left atrium, which is right here, will collect the newly oxygenated blood from your lungs through the pulmonary veins, which we'll be talking about later on, and that the left atrium will force that oxygenated blood through the mitral valve into your left ventricle, and your left ventricle is responsible for pushing that oxygenated blood into your aorta, and your aorta will thus just distribute that blood throughout the arteries in your body. There are major arteries that are connected to your aorta. These include an artery that goes to your right arm, an artery that goes to your left arm, an artery that goes up your neck into your brain to supply oxygen to your brain, and an artery that snakes down around your heart and then supplies blood to your lower body. So your aorta is that branching structure that has all these tubes. If you look up here, these tubes are the arteries that go to different parts of your body that need that oxygenated blood. So again, it carries that oxygenated blood from your heart to the rest of your body. Okay, let's talk about the Vena Cavae. So these are the veins that I was talking about, the great vessels. If we're talking about great vessels, this is the great artery. These are both the great veins. So you have a superior and you have an inferior. If you see here, when I showed you this diagram before, you might have noticed that it looks like there's two separate. Well, they are, but they both empty into the right atrium. They're both separate structures, however. So this is your superior vena cava, this one up here. It brings deoxygenated blood that travels from upper parts of your body. So remember, veins bring deoxygenated, which is your blue blood, back to your heart to get oxygenated. So your superior vena cava brings deoxygenated blood from the upper parts of the body. What do we mean by upper parts of the body? Well, we mean your arms, your neck, your brain, everything that's located above your heart is considered upper parts of your body in relation to the heart. It's called superior because if you think about it, if you think about someone who's superior than you, they're above you, they're on top of you. So this is the one that's located on the top of the heart, so it's called the superior vena cava. And then this deoxygenated blood will return to the heart, and it will use the vessel of the superior vena cava. Let's look at the inferior vena cava. It's down here, and it brings deoxygenated blood that travels from lower parts of your body. So lower parts of your body include your abdomen, as in your stomach area, and your left leg and your right leg. So everything located below the heart is considered the lower part of your body. And this is called the inferior vena cava because if you think about it, someone who's inferior than you is below you. So you can think of it that way. And lastly, it returns that deoxygenated blood to the heart using the inferior vena cava. So those are what the vena cavae are. Now let's look at some of the arteries that are actually part of this system. So I know I keep talking about arteries that go throughout your body, but you have arteries that are actually part of the heart itself to oxygenate the blood. And these are called the pulmonary arteries. The pulmonary arteries are right here. This is your left pulmonary artery, and this is your right pulmonary artery. They're circled right here. And if you see what the prefix pulmonary, the first word pulmonary is, pulmonary relates to your lungs. So these have to do with the flow from your heart to your lungs. They carry deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lung to retrieve oxygen. So let's take apart this definition. So your right atrium is receiving deoxygenated blood through your vena cavae. Then that deoxygenated blood needs to reach the lungs. So it is pushed through the tricuspid valve to your right ventricle. Your right ventricle will then push that blood, and it needs to get that deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So it'll push it through the aortic valve, the pulmonary valve, and into your pulmonary trunk, which is this structure right here. And then the pulmonary trunk will then split the deoxygenated blood into your left artery and your right artery. So these arteries will carry the deoxygenated blood from your heart, from your right ventricle to your lungs. This is the only case where you'll be seeing an artery carrying deoxygenated blood. Arteries usually carry oxygenated blood. In this case, it's carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart and to the lungs. And what happens then is these arteries take the blood to the lungs, and the lungs will get rid of the carbon dioxide in the blood and then give the blood oxygen. So now let's talk about the trunk. So this is the pulmonary trunk right here. It's a vessel arising from the right ventricle. So it's connected to the right ventricle and coming off the right ventricle. Excuse me. The pulmonary trunk then splits into your right and left pulmonary arteries that we just talked about before. These arteries then force blood into the lungs to be oxygenated, like I said before. Then this blood comes back to the heart using the pulmonary veins, and it comes back to your left atrium. Then the left atrium pushes the blood to your left ventricle, and then the left ventricle will push it into the aorta and throughout the body. So again, the trunk is just this another very large structure that is underneath the aorta. It is responsible for getting your blood to your left and right pulmonary arteries and to the lungs. So that's what the trunk is. If you hear someone talk about the pulmonary trunk, this is what they're referring to. Now let's talk about the veins that are part of your heart. They are called the pulmonary veins. Again, pulmonary relates to the lungs. They carry oxygenated blood through the lungs back to the heart to send throughout the body. So let's digest this by breaking it apart. So they're carrying oxygenated blood. Again, veins usually carry the blue or black blood, as in the deoxygenated blood. This will be one of the only cases where you see them carrying actually oxygenated blood, but we call them veins because they're carrying blood back to the heart. So after the trunk gets the deoxygenated blood in it, your left and right pulmonary arteries will push that blood to your lungs, where they'll drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. And then the blood needs to get back to the heart. So they use these pulmonary veins right here that are in yellow, and all that oxygenated blood, newly oxygenated blood, enters into your left atrium. So the blood is coming from your lungs and back to your heart using the pulmonary veins, and then thus they'll be going through these two chambers up the aorta and throughout your body. Okay, guys, so that's all I have for you today. Here's my works cited, as in some of the resources I use just to refresh myself and to collect information. I'll put them in the description box below if you also want to refer to them. A lot of these have very good explanations, very in-depth explanations. Some of these are simulations, so you can actually see blood flow throughout the atria and the ventricles if you want to see an actual live version of that. And then the last source I have is just talks about the myocardium. It's exactly what I just said, but if you just want to take some notes on that, they actually put the notes up on the screen, just like I did. But if you want to take those notes as well, please feel free to watch that video. So I'll put these all in the description box below. You can check them out after you're done watching this video. So that's all I have for you all today. I hope you enjoyed that video. It was a long time in the coming, but I'm really happy I was able to make it for all of you. Before you guys click out of this video, please like the video, subscribe to our channel to join our community, and hit the post notification bell as well. You can share our videos using our social media accounts. If you follow us on our socials, we actually post daily about the videos we have put up, so that's a constant reminder of you to go check out our YouTube channel if you forget one day. So definitely look into that. We have a website coming up soon, and that contains a plethora of things that we can't offer on our YouTube channel, as in personalized notes, our presentations, simulations of assessments you might take in class related to the topics we teach, and so forth. Lastly, we have a Gmail account, which is right here at eCoreAcademy@gmail.com. If you have any personal or business correspondences or inquiries, please contact us using that, especially if you don't want to drop a comment below. Otherwise, if you have any advice, definitely drop a comment below. We're looking forward to hearing what you all have to say about this video and other videos to come. Thank you all, and again, our socials are in the description box below. Check out the description box for everything you might possibly need, and look out for my next video. Bye!